Welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel discussion titled, Will Biden Finally Get Tough with Saudi Arabia? My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, an transpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. After months of seeking to appease Saudi Arabia and its de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, the Biden administration has concluded that it needs to reevaluate its relationship with the kingdom following the announcement that the Saudis and the OPEC Plus oil cartel has decided to cut oil production with 2 million barrels a day. The production cut will drive up cost of fuel just weeks before next month's midterm elections, and critics have characterized this move as effectively constituting election interference. But the problem goes much deeper than just oil cuts. The US-Saudi relationship has been unhealthy and one-sided for years, if not decades. The US has turned a blind eye as Saudi Arabia has destabilized the region, spread radicalism, and undercut US interest for years. Will that change now? What can and should President Biden do to rebalance the relationship with Saudi Arabia? Should it continue to provide security to Riyadh? Should the US continue to support Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen? Or should it actually take more stronger measures and even bring US troops home from the kingdom? To discuss these important questions, we are delighted to have with us Congressman Ro Khanna, Bruce Riedel of the Brookings Institute, and the Quincy Institute's own Annelle Sheline for the next hour. We're also delighted to have an audience with the C-SPAN audience with us today. If you are watching this on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and I will try to get to those questions throughout the conversation. If you're watching it on C-SPAN, you can submit your questions by tweeting it at Quincy Inst, or you can go to our Facebook or YouTube pages and submit your questions through there in the comments section. Just do a search for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft on Facebook or on YouTube. So with no further ado, let me introduce our panelists and get the discussion started. First of all, we have Representative Ro Khanna, who represents California's 17th Congressional District, located in the heart of Silicon Valley, who's serving his third term. He is the Deputy Whip of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and serves as Assistant Whip for the Democratic Caucus. Representative Khanna is committed to advancing foreign policy of military restraint and diplomatic engagement. He has also introduced recently legislation in response to the actions of the Saudis that would cut arms sales to the kingdom. After that, we have Bruce Riedel, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He served 30 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, serving overseas in the Middle East and Europe, as well as 8 years in the National Security Council at the White House, serving 4 different presidents. He's the author of 8 books. The most recent one came out last September, titled Jordan and America, An Enduring Friendship. And finally, we have Annelle Sheline, is a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute and an expert on religious and political authority in the Middle East and North Africa. She is completing a book on the strategic use of religious authority in the Arab monarchies since 9/11. So thank you all for participating. We're delighted to have you, and let me go right into it with the first question to you, Congressman Khanna. You have been a long-term advocate of a tougher policy on Saudi Arabia, in particular, putting an end to the war in Yemen and putting an end to the US's support for that war. These efforts, despite strong support in Congress, have been thwarted by the White House, both under Trump and also to a certain extent by the Biden administration. Do you think that things will be different this time around, mindful of what the Saudis have done with the oil cuts and the direct challenge to President Biden that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has now committed?
Trita, thank you. Appreciate being on this panel and appreciate my fellow panelists, Bruce, Annelle, and everyone participating. Let me say this. This is a moment like Khashoggi. After Khashoggi's murder, the Sanders and my bipartisan war powers resolution gained a lot of momentum. Before that, people weren't paying attention to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. But we actually passed the war powers resolution, first time a war powers resolution has ever passed in the history of Congress. And then again, we started to ignore some of the Saudi atrocities. But I think this has galvanized the Congress again. It is a direct slap in the face of Americans. It reeks of ingratitude, given all the arms we provide the Saudis. I mean, literally, their airplanes couldn't fly if it weren't for American technicians. And the timing of it is suspect. It also is a slap in the face of the president, who went to Saudi Arabia to try to engage. So I believe there will be consequences. This is a miscalculation strategically from the Saudis. And I anticipate the White House will take action and that there's broad support in the Congress to take action.
Bruce, we see that in Congress, Congressman Khanna is leading some efforts to take action. But what is the menu of things that the president, the United States as a whole, can do? And is it the right move by the president to say, I want Congress to lead on this stuff, rather than actually the president doing it himself? What are the various things he can do? And should it be led by Congress, or should it be led by the president himself?
Thank you for having me on the panel today. I completely agree with the congressman that this is a moment like Khashoggi. We've seen a pattern of Saudi behavior ever since King Salman ascended the throne, starting off with the horrendous decision to intervene in the Yemen war. This is a dangerous and reckless crown prince. The president should take the lead. He is assured of support on the Hill. I think he's assured of support from within the Democratic Party. I think he's assured of support from much of the press, but he needs to lead. Cutting off arms sales is a good step. We also need to look at the provision of spare parts and maintenance. We need to look at contractors in Saudi Arabia. One of the things we learned last year in Afghanistan is that the United States government can compel contractors to leave a country. We could compel contractors to leave Saudi Arabia as well. That will effectively ground the Royal Saudi Air Force, or at least significant parts of it. He should also appeal to his British and French counterparts. After all, Britain and France are part of NATO. They're at war indirectly in the Ukraine as well, supporting the Ukrainians. They should be driven into this effort as well. It's going to take a broad effort, but I think those military to military steps are a very good place to start. That doesn't mean that we would give up our relationship with Saudi Arabia. It just means we would demilitarize most of our relationship with Saudi Arabia. We could still look to Saudi Arabia for support on issues like ending the war in Yemen, which is an urgent responsibility, which unfortunately the ceasefire has now lapsed. Thankfully, full-scale war has not begun again, but without a lot of encouragement, it could easily go in that direction. So I think those are areas where the United States should take action, and the president should lead that action. Because after all, this was very much a public humiliation of the president of the United States, who, after saying he would treat MBS as a pariah, reluctantly agreed to go to Jeddah and meet with him, and now has had, as one person wrote, a gut punch from the Saudi crown prince.
I want to get back to exactly what the lead up to all of this and why the president ended up going on that trip that was so heavily criticized both before and after. But I want to bring Annelle into the conversation. Bruce mentioned the war in Yemen. Now, this is a war that's been going on for several years. The United States has unfortunately supported that war effort, even though there's been promises to put an end to it. In fact, Biden himself last February said that this war must end. Now, there was a truce. That truce has elapsed. Full-scale war has not started. But if the United States were to take some of these measures that were just mentioned, no more spare parts, not allowing the airplanes of Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen, what would that mean for that war? Would it help diplomacy get a second chance? Or, as some critics say, perhaps encourage the Houthis to go on the offensive, and rather than actually seeing an end to the war, we might see a different kind of intensification of the war.
Thanks so much, Trita. That's a very important point, and many thanks to my fellow panelists for talking about this today. I think one crucial thing to keep in mind here, although the future of what happens in Yemen is obviously of crucial importance given the scale of the humanitarian devastation there, it's also important that the U.S. focus on our own interests here. And so it is a question of why is the United States continuing to help Saudi Arabia wage this war? From my opinion, it is crucial that control of the war in Yemen be returned to the hands of Yemenis, such that it is no longer this proxy conflict with the Saudis fighting on behalf of the former government of President Hadi, now the Presidential Leadership Council that has taken over. That, Yemenis need to figure out how they're going to address this and how they're going to work out power sharing in the future. But as long as this remains a proxy conflict for Iranian involvement and Saudi involvement, the civil war is likely to continue. We know that about civil wars, that foreign involvement tends to extend them. Whereas if the control of the war were returned to Yemenis themselves, eventually they would need to work out a power sharing agreement because they would run out of resources. One crucial point I think to make here in thinking about what it is that Congress can do, I very much agree with Bruce Riedel's point that Biden needs to lead here, but it's also important that whatever Biden do extend past his term. If we saw a Trump or a similar sort of figure take power at whatever point in the future and maybe jump right back into bed with the Saudis, whatever Biden had done would go up in smoke. And so I do think it's important that Congress also take the lead here. And this is one crucial point about the Yemen War Powers Resolution, is that it would be implemented with a simple majority, whereas some of the other legislative solutions that have been proposed would have to be filibuster proof. So I do think it is very crucial to keep in mind that we have the Yemen War Powers Resolution that is just waiting to be brought to the floor. And again, many thanks to Representative Khanna for all of his leadership on that issue. But again, I do think that this is not only a question of the future of U.S. interests in the region and not being involved in sort of fighting Saudi Arabia's dirty wars, but also of reasserting congressional war-making authority, which for too long the president, many presidents have usurped that authority, and Congress really needs to reassert that constitutionally granted power.
Very good. Thank you, Annelle. And that brings me to the congressman again. Our colleagues at the Quincy Institute have written extensively about the Saudi lobby's influence in America. And you, Congressman, have been a proponent of increasing transparency about how foreign governments are attempting to influence our own government, including introducing the Bipartisan Foreign Agents Registration Modernization Act. Just some statistics here. Saudi Arabia has spent nearly $300 million on FARA-registered lobbying and public relation firms since 9/11. There are currently 24 lobbying, public relations, and other firms registered under FARA to represent Saudi interest in the United States. Congressman, so I'm interested to hearing your thought. You mentioned that this has created yet another Khashoggi moment, and political momentum exists in Congress to do something to correct this relationship. Do you think also there is a momentum to start looking a little bit deeper, as you have tried to do through that act, on the foreign lobbying that is taking place in Washington?
Yes, and this should be a bipartisan concern. I mean, the foreign influence is not just Saudi Arabia. There are other countries that have a lobbying that is influencing decision making, and many times they hire former members of Congress on influential committees to turn around and then lobby the United States on behalf of foreign interests. And that should not be tolerated. I've worked actually with Representative Mike Gallagher to try to ban former members of Congress from lobbying for foreign governments. We should have banned former senior staff from doing that, and that there needs to be much stricter disclosure requirements and ethics requirements on that. I do think that is one of the factors that has tilted U.S. policy in a direction overly lenient to the Saudis.
Very interesting. Bruce, I want to go back to something you mentioned. You mentioned the trip, how the president was convinced to go very reluctantly. According to press reports, it took 18 months for some of his advisors to manage him to get to yes on that issue. And it appears clearly to have backfired quite tremendously. But there is a narrative out there, and one of the audience members, Justin Alexander, asked what the thoughts are on the reports that MBS sharply reduced OPEC Plus's September production increase because he was unhappy with Biden's visit to Jeddah. So essentially, was there something that happened during that visit that explains this, rather than this the argument that there actually is something more profoundly unhealthy about this relationship?
I think that Crown Prince certainly was very irritated that the President of the United States had called him a pariah and then had changed his tune and came over. Whether something happened during the visit, I don't know. The readout we've gotten from the visit has been somewhat mystifying. The administration has said it was not about oil prices, but of course it was about oil prices. They said it was about Israel, but Saudi Arabia hasn't joined the Abraham Accords. It has adjusted its policy. I think, though, the critical thing here is to look at the pattern of behavior of Saudi Arabia since 2015, since the king ascended to the throne. We had the disastrous decision to start a war in Yemen. MBS told the then visiting director of Central Intelligence, John Brennan, that the war would be over in, quote, a few weeks. And Brennan writes in his memoirs that he said to himself, what is this guy smoking? Nobody's gone into a war in Yemen and it ended in a few weeks. Then, of course, we have the tragedy of Jamal Khashoggi. Then we had, at the very beginning of the Biden administration, a conspiracy by the Saudis working with former Crown Prince Hamza in Jordan to destabilize the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Bill Burns, the current director of Central Intelligence, was quick to go to the White House and tell the president about it. The president acted forcefully, calling King Abdullah. Imagine this, one of the most pivotal countries in the region, a linchpin, being destabilized by another American ally. Now, the Jordanians, for good reasons, have not highlighted the Saudi role. There are hundreds of thousands of Jordanian workers in Saudi Arabia who might lose their job. But it was an extraordinary moment. And now we have this. This is a blatant act of interference in the American electoral process. Coming when it does, a month before the election, it is bound to increase oil prices, even if the actual amount of oil is not $2 million off the ground, just the perception of it. So I think that the Biden administration needs to act, and it needs to act forcefully. One other thing I would say, the congressman is right. Saudi Arabia is not alone in this business. The president of the United Arab Emirates and Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, in many ways MBS's mentor, was in Moscow this week, publicly appearing on television with the Russian dictator. That's another example of one of our allies choosing to join Russia instead of choosing to join in support of the Ukraine. And I would hope that we would have some reconsideration of our relationship with the Emirates. Why in the world are we going to sell the United Arab Emirates F-35 jet fighters? The last thing the Persian Gulf needs is a new advanced stage weaponry of F-35s. Seems to me that that's an arms sale that really should be given second thought about whether the wisdom of going forward with it.
Very interesting. And as you mentioned, you know, the timing of this clearly seems to be designed to have an impact on the midterms. But I would love to hear your thoughts, as well as Annelle and Congressman, if you believe that the surprise in the increase, because earlier on, the talk was that there would be a potentially 1 million barrel cut, and then suddenly it became 2 million. Was that also something that was deliberately done to shock the markets, push up oil prices as much as possible in order to undermine President Biden? Bruce, you want to go first?
Sure. One thing we know from the pattern of MBS's behavior is he loves drama. And the more dramatic, the better. In many ways, he's much like his other mentor, Donald Trump. And 2 million barrels is much more of a shock to the system than 1 million barrels. And the timing, I can't overstress the drama that the timing has produced. MBS wants Donald Trump back. They fared very well in the Trump administration. And the Trump administration, as Donald Trump has said, protected MBS after the Khashoggi event. And the midterms are the first step towards bringing Trump back into the White House. If the Democrats lose the House and the Senate, they'll be one step closer to getting their man back into the Oval Office.
Annelle, do you see it the same way? And love to hear your thoughts on how, if there's been a break in the manner in which the Saudis use oil policy under MBS.
Absolutely. I think this is something, Bruce has mentioned several times, that we have seen quite a difference in the way the Saudis approach oil policy. So while certainly, since the 1970s oil embargo, there have been a lot of calls for the need for energy independence, that the United States, should no longer be subject to the whims of a country like Saudi Arabia, and which is very true. But at the same time, throughout and until around 2015, when Salman and Mohammed bin Salman came into power, we did see Saudi Arabia prioritizing price stability. In general, this is something that they alone have the capacity to do because they are able to ramp up or ramp down production, which is something that the United States cannot do, in part because the U.S. oil industry is run by private companies, which are beholden to shareholders to maximize profit. Whereas the Saudis, because it is run by the Saudi state, can pursue more political objectives. And so again, for decades, their political objective was price stability, which is part of why the U.S.-Saudi relationship has weathered so many stressors, including the realization after 9/11 that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi. And so this is what is different now, is with Salman and Mohammed bin Salman in power, we see a huge shift. We see this willingness to allow the price of oil to fluctuate wildly. For example, we saw MBS pursuing a price war with Russia during the early in 2020 when the price of oil cratered as a result of COVID, and that price war drove the price of a barrel of oil below $0 for the first time in history, and that prompted outrage from President Trump and senators like Ted Cruz, who represents the state of Texas, and other oil producers, who also talked about the fact that maybe it was time for U.S. troops to get out of Saudi Arabia. So as Bruce has said, things are really fundamentally different now under MBS. I think the characterization of him as someone who is really interested in drama is on point. And so again, this just gets to this question of, is the United States finally going to reevaluate this relationship? We can no longer count on the Saudis for the price stability that they did once provide. And I think the question there is, can we afford to do so? Because we do remain dependent, unfortunately, on fossil fuels. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Annelle. Congressman, several of the audience members have asked questions about whether a tougher stance would just drive the Saudis into the arms of Russia and China. And you have been a leader on Capitol Hill for several years now, asking for a different relationship in which pressure on Saudi Arabia and a tougher attitude at times is necessary. And we've seen in the run-up to this visit that the administration made the argument that, yes, perhaps this is a bit of a sacrifice of American values, fist bumping this crown prince, but it was necessary because of geopolitical imperatives, which meant if we don't do this, Saudi Arabia is going to move closer to Russia and China. As a key proponent of a different approach to Saudi Arabia, how do you answer that criticism?
Well, first of all, they already are moving closer to Putin. I mean, the reality is they have 70% margins on the barrel of oil that they sell. They made almost $100 billion in 2022. Putin doesn't have that margin because he's selling at a discount of $35 a barrel to China and India. And this increase in price and decrease in production is partly driven to help Putin. The reality is that they cannot switch over to Putin or China in terms of their weapons, in terms of the technicians that are needed to fly planes overnight. It's a process that would take years, if not a decade. We have so much joint defense arrangements with the Saudis that were multiplied under the Trump administration. I don't think people even have a full appreciation for it. A lot of that production is done in Saudi. They have access to some of our most sensitive technology. So we have far more leverage in this situation than people realize, and that there is a lot we can do to make sure that the Saudis are being reciprocal and aren't committing human rights violations, which still will require them to have a relationship with the United States. So I think it is a red herring to say that suddenly they're going to go get all their arms from China and Russia.
And as you pointed out, apparently they're already moving and aligning oil production with Vladimir Putin against US's explicit wishes. How much worse could it get? Let's say that their argument has some truth, and as a thought experiment, what do you think they actually could do beyond these more unrealistic things that they would suddenly start importing all of their arms and rely on security from Russia, which cannot even handle the current war it's in, and China, who frankly has shown no interest of providing security for any other state outside of its own borders? Congressman.
Well, I think they're already at the level of cuts that are probably what OPEC could stomach. I mean, there was opposition within OPEC for this 2 million cut. So I don't think that they can have cuts that are drastically beyond what they did. I think they did the shock value cuts already, and at some point, other OPEC countries will cheat if they try to go further. They may have more cosmetic meetings with Xi Jinping or Putin. They may try to have some agreements, and I guess they'll try to get away with as much as they can while there are no consequences. If there start to be consequences in the United States, then they'll have to have a different cost-benefit calculation.
Very interesting. And one of the audience members, Frank Lamson, asked a question, in the context of whether there's an effort now, not just to impose consequences, as the congressman pointed out, but also to actually do something to make sure that oil prices do not go up. Would dropping sanctions on Venezuela and Iran have the necessary counter impact compared to what the Saudis now have done? Bruce, you want to take that question?
Certainly. The Saudis imposed an oil embargo on the United States back in 1973. We all remember that. But most of the cutoffs in oil imports to the United States from Middle East countries have come as a consequence of American sanctions. If we didn't have American sanctions on Iran, we could import more oil from the Iranians. We could diversify our sources of supply. Same is true with Venezuela. I understand that oil sanctions is a method of sending a signal of our disapproval of the behavior of the Iranians and others. But if you think of it purely in our own self-interest terms, we're shooting ourselves in the foot with all of these sanctions. We should find more sophisticated ways of going against them. And this is perhaps a particularly important time to think about that. While Iranians are demonstrating against their government, we could lift sanctions not to help the government, but to send the signal to the Iranian people, the United States is with you, and we want to see you take over your economy. And we support your efforts. And if you can change your leadership in Tehran, this is what's going to happen. And to encourage that, we're going to do it even sooner than that. we should stop hindering the flow of oil, because after all, that's what we say we want from the Middle East, is affordable oil at prices that we can live with. So yes, I think it's time to think not just about our relationship with Saudi Arabia, but given events going on in Iran, broader thought about what kind of relationship we want with the whole region in the future. All this talk about security is all about Iran. And the Biden administration, like its predecessors, has seemed to be preoccupied with Iranian paranoia. I think it's much exaggerated.
Interesting. So, when Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, sabotage, whatever yet happened there, Secretary Blinken at one point said that this is an opportunity for Europe to reduce its dependence on Russian gas. Are you saying that beyond imposing consequences on the Saudis in terms of arms sales, etc., that there's also an opportunity here to reduce dependence on Saudi oil and as a result diversify, whether it's going to other oil producers, but also perhaps, as some people have asked in the Q&A, that this is an opportunity to actually start moving away from oil to a larger extent, because if we don't, we still will be in some form of a situation in which oil producers will have this type of influence on us. I would actually pose that question to all of the panelists. Annelle, if you want to go first. You are on mute. Okay, why don't we go with Congressman Khanna in the meantime?
In terms of balancing the relationship, Trita?
Oh, in terms of, instead of just thinking of what are the costs that can be imposed on Saudi Arabia to make sure that there's consequences for their actions as you presented, isn't this also potentially an opportunity to reduce our dependency, A, on Saudi Arabia, and B, perhaps on oil as a whole, diversifying who we import oil from, but also diversifying our various energy sources?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this shows the volatility of oil and why we need a moonshot in renewable energy long term. I mean, look, the oil production in the United States is up under President Biden. It is at 11.8 million barrels in 2022, which is higher than 2020 and 2021. It's projected to go to 12.6 million in 2023, which is higher than Trump's record in 2019. So this idea that somehow we're not producing oil is just factually false. But what we see is that it's still a commodity that has high volatility. And the more we diversify, the better. And that's why we need a moonshot in renewable energy. And that also will deprive petrostates of the leverage that they have. So this should help inform a foreign policy that really prioritizes more rapid development of renewable energy.
Annelle, do you agree?
Absolutely. I think there is this notion that the United States could just drill its way out of the problem. You hear that talking point that we just need to tap more into our own oil resources. But the United States does not have sufficient oil capacity to set the price of oil the way that Saudi Arabia does. Again, because we can't kind of ramp up and scale down our own production capacity, as I said. Partly the nature of the oil that the United States produces, this shale oil, it doesn't come spurting out of the ground as easily as Saudi oil does. And again, because it's privately controlled, these companies just have to maximize shareholder profits. So again, this notion that just ramping up American capacity would protect us from these decisions of oil producers abroad is patently false. We will always remain dependent on these other countries as long as we remain dependent on oil. So this is crucial that we shift away from fossil fuel dependence. And what's interesting is this notion of I think some climate change, activists who are very concerned, as am I myself, about climate change, might say, you know, it's great that the price of oil is going to be really high because that will help encourage a shift towards alternatives, which is true. But at the same time, when the price of oil is high, that does help encourage additional investment by oil companies in additional exploration, the new production facilities, which just furthers the ongoing infrastructure that depends on oil, such that eventually the price of oil will come back down, which again will be a breath of relief for ordinary Americans powering their homes and filling up at the gas station. But again, we'll just maintain this cycle of dependence on foreign oil producers. So I completely agree with Representative Khanna that it is long past time for us to invest in alternatives. Luckily, we did see some of that with Biden's big legislation that came through over the summer, but those promises what was accomplished fell far short of what had been promised earlier in terms of investment in alternative energy.
Thank you, Annelle. You actually answered preemptively a question from Dennis DeTio exactly about that topic. Thank you. Bruce, do you want to comment quickly on this before we move on?
Yes, I'll just say very simply, the existential threat to America is not if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it's climate change. And anything that can help reduce climate change, slow down climate change, is very much in our national interests. And as every American who lives on the East Coast discovered just recently, climate change is coming at us head on, and the results can be devastating. This would be a good way to diversify as well as take action to reduce our dependence in the long run on fossil fuel.
Thank you, Bruce. We have several questions. John Hoffman, Reed Smith, asking, what about the Emirati dimension of all of this? I know, Bruce, you touched upon it a little bit, but there seems to be a pattern in which most of the attention goes to Saudi Arabia, perhaps because of MBS's love for drama, but the Emiratis are still working there pretty much hand in glove with the Saudis on a lot of these different things, but are getting far less attention for their role in this. And we have seen that also now, the Emiratis and their relationship with Russia, for instance. And they were in favor of this cut as well. Is there a distance between them? Will a tougher policy on Saudi Arabia be ineffective unless it is also coupled with a different approach to the Emirates? Bruce, you want to start off with that?
Certainly. The difference is that MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, is a far more clever, thoughtful practitioner of international affairs than his Saudi counterpart. MBZ not only likes drama, but he often makes what are really stupid decisions. Going into Yemen was a truly stupid decision. Killing Jamal Khashoggi was not a threat to MBS. I mean, he may have been irritant, but he was not a threat. And this latest decision, who in the world would back Putin in the war in Ukraine when it's obvious to everybody in the world that Putin is losing the war in Ukraine and may well soon find himself without a job in Moscow and lots of time to spend with his family, although I suspect that's not how Putin's end will come. Yes, I think it's time to take a good, hard look at our relations with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Bahrain. Now, the Emirates and Bahrain have also been very clever in using the Abraham Accords to help build a relationship with the Israelis. That's all great and good, but that doesn't mean they should be rewarded with F-35s, for example, because they decided to open up a relationship with Israel. It's just mind-boggling to me that we would be introducing this new advanced system of warfare into a region which is already plagued with so much violence and so much instability. The last thing you need to do is pour gasoline on a fire. And that's what, in fact, we are doing with some of these arms sales.
Congressman, same question to you. You mentioned earlier on that what the Saudis have done here, and it's not them alone, has created a new Khashoggi moment, perhaps. Would you say that that is also true in the sense that there is political momentum and willingness to also review, reevaluate the relationship with the UAE, which has been a partner of the Saudis on a lot of the different things that we object to, including the war in Yemen?
Well, there was certainly with Yemen, and we included the UAE in much of the criticism. And then my understanding is that the UAE, at least directly, stopped having engagement in the bombing of Yemen. Now they still are engaged, but they also have been more responsive than the Saudis. I think to Bruce's point, MBZ is a more sophisticated actor, and they don't benefit as much, frankly, from the U.S. relationship. So they certainly should not be left out of the conversation, and we need to have a frank understanding that they're part of OPEC and part of the decision. But I don't think it is unreasonable to focus first and foremost the attention on the Saudis as we have.
Interesting. Thank you. We have an interesting question from David Sanchez, who raises, I think, a very important point, pointing out that over the course of the last couple of years, the United States is increasingly seen by friends and non-friends alike as a less reliable partner. We saw what happened under the Trump years of pulling out of several different agreements. We see now what the Biden administration is saying, that they cannot tie the hands of a future president, essentially citing our political polarization or our democratic system as something that then supersedes the otherwise natural and normal norm, which is that countries are expected to adhere to the agreements they sign. But given that, is there an argument to say that the Saudis may actually feel that the unreliability of the United States and the political polarization here, just from their pure self-interest, means that they actually do have to move closer to Russia and China, even if we impose consequences on them or not imposing consequences on them? Annelle, do you want to start off with that?
Sure. So, I do think that it is reasonable that countries behave in their own self-interest, and as the United States is dealing with the fact that we are in an increasingly multipolar world, Russia, demonstrating itself to perhaps be a bit of a paper tiger, but China absolutely being much more powerful. And the United States is going to have to engage in a different kind of policy making than this sort of hegemonic military power that we have enjoyed since the fall of the USSR. And so again, it is not unreasonable that countries might start to diversify their security partners, might start to hedge a little bit, not wanting to antagonize some of these big, powerful countries. But this also means the US needs to update our policies. And so in the past, where we had such overwhelming power and could extend such a massive security guarantee, that it made sense to maintain something like our relationship with Saudi Arabia through thick and thin. Now we need to reconsider that and think about if they are behaving in ways that undermine our national interests, perfectly rational on their part, but in ways that really do hurt US interests, we need to really reconsider our relationship with them as well. And moving forward, the United States is going to have to figure out, how do we navigate a world where we are no longer the sole superpower and instead are having to deal with the reality of other powerful international players as well.
Thank you, Annelle. Bruce, you want to comment on that as well?
Yes, I think we cannot underestimate the disruptive impact of the Trump administration. No other American president has seriously proposed that we leave NATO. No other American president has seriously proposed that we withdraw all of our troops from Germany. He violated the Iran Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. If there is an example of a president who does not live up to prior presidents' commitments, it's Donald Trump. And I think that should be an additional piece of worry here. This Saudi move was definitely intended not only to benefit Putin, but to benefit Donald Trump. It's bizarre that the former president had a policy of sympathy for autocrats and dictators, and was the opponent of elected governments like the Merkel government, Trudeau government. It's going to take a while for the disruptive behavior of 4 years of the Trump administration to be washed out of the system. And that's, of course, assuming that he doesn't have round two in 2024. We need to get back to having more of a bipartisan consensus about the basics of American foreign policy. And I'm hopeful that on this issue of the war in Ukraine and not supporting Russia and therefore not helping it with reducing oil production, we will see some Republicans coming over and joining the what I think is a very unanimous Democratic view that we have to have a change in this relationship, a fundamental change in this relationship.
If I could stay with you for a moment, Bruce, we have a very interesting question from Philippe Capet in the chat. Most of our conversation so far has been what the impact would be on US-Saudi relations and potentially the impact it could have on Saudi's relationship with Russia and China. But he's asking the question of, if actually the United States finally were to get tough, impose consequences on Saudi Arabia, what would the signals be for the rest of the Arab world? What impact would it have on the relations of the US with other countries in the region, and perhaps also the relationship between those countries and Saudi Arabia itself? I'm going to start off with Bruce and then go to Annelle and the congressman on that as well.
Sure. Make sure I'm not muted.
Yeah, you're good.
You're good. Okay. It's not widely discussed, but there is, in fact, a widespread resentment in the region of the role Saudi Arabia plays. Because they have so much money, they throw their money around, or they don't throw their money around. And countries that desperately need their foreign assistance, like Jordan, like Oman, have to come begging hat in hand. I think if they see that the Saudis are in bad odor in Washington, you'll see many of them distance themselves from Saudi Arabia as well. I want to add one other point.
And what would the consequences of that be? How would a region where countries actually do distance themselves from Saudi Arabia, how would that look like?
For one thing, it could be much greater criticism of the Saudi role in Yemen. While the ceasefire was definitely a step in the right direction, it failed to totally lift the blockade of Yemen. Yes, it allows in more fuel, and there are commercial air flights out, but the fundamentals of the blockade have remained in place. This is what the Houthis were asking for when they said that they wouldn't sign up for re-extension, that the fundamental blockade has to be brought to an end. And I think that the war in Yemen is very unpopular with the people in the Arab world, the Muslim world in general. It was interesting at the beginning of the war, the Saudis, MBS, pressed Pakistan to send troops to fight. And not then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif realized that that would not be a popular move with the Pakistani people. So he used the old dodge of, well, I'll have to ask my parliament, knowing full well that the parliament would vote unanimously against sending troops. So I think American distancing from Saudi Arabia could also lead to some distancing from some of their Arab friends who are really uncomfortable with the way Saudi Arabia dominates the politics of the region and dominates the economics of the region.
Interesting. Annelle, what are your thoughts on the same question?
I think Bruce is absolutely right. This would have repercussions throughout the rest of the region, as well as just sending a signal to other American partners in the rest of the world that if you behave in a manner that directly contravenes US interests, there will be consequences. I think another crucial element to consider here would be the signal this would send to the US weapons manufacturing industry that has had such a stranglehold on our political process. And so, when we bring up things like reconsidering our relationship with Saudi Arabia, there's this concern what's that going to do to American jobs, people who depend on the U.S. weapons manufacturing industry, which is a false premise. This is an industry that actually, doesn't create that many jobs, in contrast to something like an investment in green energy, for example, better healthcare infrastructure, better education infrastructure. All of those are more labor intensive and arguably a sort of more preferable sorts of jobs that a lot of Americans would like to do rather than manufacturing weapons. But up to this point, the military-industrial complex has been able to frighten politicians or to buy off politicians, to frighten the foreign policy establishment about what would be the repercussions of cutting back our weapons sales to the Saudis, for example, or any of these other countries. This would be fundamentally against U.S. interests, when in fact it would not. It would be fundamentally against their interests and their profit margins. But it would help the United States move out of this horrible cycle where, as Bruce says, we continue to flood the region and the entire world with massive amounts of weapons, and go back to this false narrative that so many U.S. jobs depend on it, which is just fundamentally incorrect, and is another major example of the need for a rethink, not only in our energy policy, but in our industrial production of weapons that we ship abroad.
Thank you, Annelle. On the point that you raise about the arms sales, the companies that are making huge profits of it, this is not necessarily the US's interest, this is their profit margins. Congressman, they have been very active. They have been protective of the Saudi-US relationship. One of our colleagues here at the Quincy Institute, Bill Hartung, asks questions about them. Do you expect them to put up a big fight against any effort on your end, your colleagues' end, to put an end or a pause on arms sales, on war powers? Will you be facing them? And will they put up a big fight? Or is the situation such that even they perhaps now are feeling that it might not be a good PR move for them to be on the side of MBS as he is now, as Bruce said, deliberately trying to interfere in the US's democratic processes?
Well, I don't think they will be putting up the fight in their own names. They're more subtle than that, and they often have former members of Congress or lobbyists or national security officials who make the argument in terms of national security interests and are often being funded or supported by some of these defense contractors. The important thing to know, though, about a lot of these jobs is some of these jobs are in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the production of some of the weapons are actually being done in Saudi Arabia, which is shocking. I mean, most other allies don't have that kind of an agreement. So I do think, though, the outrage of the Saudis being so direct in turning down the president and hurting the American people is going to make it hard for even lobbyists of defense contractors to argue against action that has consequences. I think when you're looking at MBS, they are perhaps hoping for a return of Donald Trump. But what they need to be thinking is not what happens in the next 4 years in America. And I certainly will do everything in my power to make sure it's not a return of Trump. But regardless, they need to be thinking, what is the strategy over the next 10 to 15 years? And what they don't understand is, regardless of the outcome of the 2024 election, there is a whole generation of people in Congress who do not come from a tradition of seeing the Saudis as this traditional ally in the Cold War. Now they're reversing that anyway by aligning with Putin, and they're eroding their goodwill in the Congress that had been there accumulated over 40 years. And someone who is more prudent, as frankly I think the Saudi ambassador understands here, it would counsel Saudi Arabia that what they're doing is just strategically not in the interest of maintaining a long-term constructive relationship with the United States.
We haven't seen much of that type of a long-term thinking, however, so it doesn't seem terribly likely that that will happen anytime soon. But it touches on a very interesting question that Sean Tandon is asking from AFP in the chat, which is, first of all, give me an assessment of how likely you think it is that the administration actually will do something concrete that is meaningful and has consequences, rather than more of these symbolic things. And secondly, assuming that something happens, is there and should there be a pathway for Saudi Arabia to get back into the good graces of the United States in order to truly be able to move this relationship in a positive direction that is mutually beneficial? And if so, what would that pathway look like? Bruce, you want to start?
Certainly. I would put the pathway straight through Yemen. An end to the blockade, the withdrawal of Saudi forces from controlling, occupying parts of Yemen, particularly the part of Yemen borders on Oman. And by the way, the same is true for the Emiratis. The Emiratis ought to give Socotra Island back to the Yemeni people. That's a major part of the pathway. I think what we could also look for is not a complete change in human rights policy, but some melting of the relationship. And one last small point, but one that's important to me, let Mohammed bin Nayef travel abroad and live a life not under threat from the government. Mohammed bin Nayef went out of his way to save American lives. But we owe this man a responsibility to do something to help him, when he's being tortured by his successor.
Annelle.
I absolutely agree with Bruce. And just one point of clarification. So Mohammed bin Nayef had been the crown prince when King Salman became king in 2015, and then was supplanted by MBS, and has been in detention and, as Bruce said, subject to torture since that time. And he was a crucial ally and partner with the United States in counterterror efforts after 9/11. So very much agree with Bruce on that point. And also very much agree on the centrality of Yemen, that this is a point of great instability for the region, remains one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. And again, this is not only has to do with the fundamental morality of trying to address human suffering there, but historically Yemen has been a source of terrorist attacks against Americans and American targets. And so it's crucial that the United States get out of fighting this war on Saudi Arabia's behalf. This is very much seen as a Saudi-US war that is being waged against the people of Yemen. And so this is, I think, as I mentioned before, that is one benefit of the Yemen War Powers Resolution, would be that it would not have to be filibuster proof. It would only require a simple majority to pass. So again, I want to thank Representative Khanna for all of his leadership on that front. And the other major issue here, you'd asked whether we think that this will lead to a fundamental shift. And I think it's unfortunate, again, that the United States does remain so dependent on fossil fuels that that we are in this position again 50 years after the oil embargo, and yet here we are. But I just would hope that Biden would live up to some of his promises, the promises that the Democratic Party had made about transitioning away from fossil fuels. I think this is a huge opportunity for us to finally make good on some of those investments required to make that transition possible.
Thanks so much, Annelle. And Congressman, final word to you. What we've heard from Annelle and Bruce primarily is that the path for Saudi Arabia to get back into the good graces would be through Yemen. Do you agree? Do you see other things? And what conditions would you like to see put in place in order, for instance, some of the legislation you're trying to get through to be lifted, meaning that an arms embargo, for instance, would be lifted?
Well, I agree with Bruce and Annelle that Yemen is absolutely critical. I mean, the president ran on that. That's why he called the Saudis a pariah state. It was Khashoggi's murder, it was the brutal humanitarian catastrophe. And the most concrete step they can take is the lifting of the blockade. I mean, that has been the sore point when they claim they're making progress and working towards the ceasefire, or still abiding by the terms of the ceasefire. It's the blockade that has been at the heart of concern of so many in Congress. But beyond that, I think at a simple level, they need to reverse some of the production cuts. I think that is something that the president will really look to, and that they should not be blackmailing the American public, the American consumers, at a time that we have an energy crisis. So this is not a relationship that cannot be redeemed. It's going to be different than it was in the past, but there are actions that they can take, and that's why much of the legislation, I don't view it as a threat as much as it's a consequence and reaction to actions that they've taken. A war in Yemen that has been the largest humanitarian crisis, the murder of Khashoggi, and now jacking up American gas prices at a time where Americans are facing the biggest energy challenge in decades. So if they take a different turn in their relationship, then that would have a different response from the United States. I just would end by saying that both Khashoggi and this decision, though, are deep wounds in the relationship that will take a significant time for them to recover from.
Thank you so much, Congressman, and we will end it with those words of wisdom. There is a path, but the wounds are deep, are not going to be easily healed. Thank you, Congressman, for participating in this excellent conversation. Thank you, Annelle. Thank you, Bruce. We hope to have you all back soon. For all of you who are watching, if you have not subscribed to the Quincy Institute's newsletter, go to quincyinst.org. Subscribe to the newsletter so you will get notifications of all of our future events and publications. And we look forward to speaking to you all again very soon. Thank you so much.